Look at these two images carefully. In the first, Nicolas Maduro stands beside Chinese diplomats, smiling, calling Xi Jinping an older brother. It is calm, orderly, predictable. In the second, taken just hours later, the same man is on a US warship, blindfolded, handcuffed, dragged out of power in gray sweats. This was not just the removal of a Venezuelan president. It was the violent interruption of a relationship China spent decades cultivating quietly, patiently, methodically. China builds influence through contracts, infrastructure, and time. It hates chaos. And Donald Trump thrives on it. That is why this raid sent shockwaves far beyond Caracas. Because when the rules of the international system are broken so openly, the country most at risk is not Venezuela. If you want to understand why Beijing is deeply unsettled and why this moment matters to the global balance of power, stay with me. Because to grasp what comes next, we need to step back and see the system Trump just disrupted. To understand why this moment unsettled Beijing, we need to be precise about what actually happened. China did not just lose an ally overnight. It lost certainty. For decades, Beijing has operated under a simple assumption: power should be exercised within a predictable framework. Even rivals follow rules. Even conflict has boundaries. Trump's move in Venezuela shattered that assumption. By acting unilaterally against a sovereign government, Washington sent a signal that rules can be suspended when interests demand it. Not negotiated, not contained, simply overridden. For China, this is deeply destabilizing because Beijing's global strategy depends on order, on contracts being honored, on long-term investments protected by international norms. Venezuela was a textbook example of that model. Oil in exchange for capital, infrastructure, and loyalty. No ideology, no drama, and suddenly all of it was exposed to chaos. This is not about whether China can absorb losses in Caracas. It is about whether the system it relies on still exists. And to see why that system mattered so much, we have to look at how this relationship was built in the first place. The relationship between Beijing and Caracas did not emerge by accident. It was built slowly through need, timing, and opportunity. At the turn of the century, China was expanding at historic speed. Its factories needed fuel. Its cities needed power. Oil was not optional, it was strategic. Venezuela, sitting on some of the world's largest reserves, needed something else: cash. Its economy was fragile. Western capital was drying up. China stepped in. What followed was a straightforward bargain. Beijing provided more than $100 billion in loans, financing, railways, power plants, and infrastructure. In return, Venezuela shipped oil east. No speeches about democracy, no lectures, just transactions. By last year, roughly 80% of Venezuelan oil flowed to China. For Beijing, that was manageable risk, only a small share of total imports, but enormous strategic influence. This was China's preferred way of expanding power, quietly, contract by contract, country by country. A long game played within the rules of the international system. And then, in a single night, that carefully constructed model collided with something it was never designed to handle: chaos. And that collision would soon expose the deeper crisis beneath the surface. The crisis did not begin with speeches or sanctions. It began with a single, stunning image: a sitting president seized in a nighttime raid, removed without negotiation, displayed as proof of American resolve. For Beijing, this was a warning shot. China immediately condemned the move, accusing Washington of acting like a world judge and violating international law. Those words were not for Caracas. They were for the system, because the real shock was not Maduro's removal. It was the method. If a sovereign government could be treated this way, then no investment, no matter how carefully structured, was truly safe. Contracts meant less. Stability meant less, and Suddenly, Chinese companies operating in Venezuela faced questions they had never needed to answer before. Could their assets be nationalized, marginalized, dragged into a geopolitical storm they did not create? If you are watching this and wondering why China reacted so sharply, this is why. This was not ideology. It was risk management. And as Beijing absorbed that shock, it became clear this was not an isolated event. It was the first crack in a much larger system. And to understand what really broke, we need to look beneath the surface at the mechanisms holding that system together. What this moment exposed was not a failure of diplomacy, but a clash of systems. China's global strategy is built on predictability. Loans instead of troops, contracts instead of ultimatums. Influence gained quietly over time. This approach depends on one crucial assumption, that international norms, however imperfect, will be respected. That great powers will push boundaries but not erase them. Trump's move in Venezuela challenged that assumption head-on. By acting first and justifying later, Washington signaled that power no longer needs consensus to be legitimate. It only needs capability. For Beijing, this is deeply uncomfortable because China's investments are not designed to survive chaos. They are designed to operate within order where governments stay in place, agreements endure, and risk can be calculated. When that order collapses, China faces a dilemma. Retreat and lose influence, or stay and absorb uncertainty it cannot control. This is why the raid mattered more than any single asset or loan. It suggested that the ground rules themselves were shifting, and once rules become optional, every long-term strategy becomes fragile. That realization would soon be reinforced by a second, more dangerous escalation, one that pushed this crisis beyond Venezuela alone. The second escalation came not from Caracas, but from Washington. When the U.S. Secretary of State declared that the Western Hemisphere would not be allowed to become a base for America's adversaries, competitors, and rivals, the message was unmistakable. This was not about Venezuela anymore. It was about China. For Beijing, that statement confirmed its worst suspicions. This was not a one-off operation. It was a doctrine, a claim that geography still defines power, that proximity trumps partnership, and that China's growing presence in Latin America would be treated not as competition but as provocation. Beijing understood the implication immediately. If the US was willing to act so forcefully in Venezuela, then every Chinese foothold in the region could become a liability. Ports, energy projects, infrastructure. This is where uncertainty turned into anxiety. China could not retaliate. It could not escalate, and it could not disengage without losing ground. It had spent decades securing. So Beijing did what it does best. It waited, watched, calculated, but waiting this time came with a new and unsettling question, one that reached far beyond Latin America. Because if rules could be broken here, what did that mean elsewhere? And that question would soon shift the focus from oil and contracts to something far more sensitive. People, now step away from strategy for a moment and think about what this looks like if you are living inside the system. If you are a worker in Venezuela, chaos is not an abstract word. It means jobs frozen, prices rising, uncertainty becoming daily life. And if you are in Beijing or Sao Paulo or Jakarta watching this unfold, you start asking a different question. Not who is right, but who is safe. Because when a great power tears up the rules, it is ordinary people who absorb the shock first. Investments stall, currencies wobble, governments grow cautious. You may never care about oil contracts or geopolitical doctrine, but you do care about stability, about whether tomorrow will look like today. And that is why moments like this matter to you. Because when predictability disappears, opportunity disappears with it. If this analysis helps you see global power differently, take a moment to reflect on that. Understanding systems is the first step to navigating them. And as people feel the ground shift beneath them, the consequences no longer stay local. They spread, and the next wave of impact moves far beyond Venezuela and far beyond China. The ripple effects of this moment extend far beyond one country or one region. Across South America, governments are watching closely, not to choose sides, but to assess risk. For years, Chinese investment has offered an alternative to Western capital. Fewer conditions, longer timelines, a promise of partnership rather than pressure. But now, that calculation is changing. If hosting major Chinese projects risks attracting unwanted American attention, caution replaces enthusiasm. Ports become liabilities. Infrastructure becomes leverage. This is not hypothetical. The United States has already signaled that Chinese holdings tied to critical infrastructure like ports near the Panama Canal are unacceptable. That message travels fast. For China, this is deeply troubling. Latin America is not peripheral to Beijing's strategy. It is a vital source of energy, food, and raw materials, with two-way trade exceeding $500 billion. The danger is not immediate loss. It is hesitation, delay, a slow erosion of influence as partners quietly step back. And history offers a warning here. The United States once believed control over Iraq's oil would stabilize the region. It did not. China eventually became the largest buyer of Iraqi crude anyway. Something similar could happen again, but only after prolonged instability. And that brings us to the question that now hangs over Beijing's strategy. What comes next? From Beijing's perspective, three possible futures are now on the table. The first is the optimistic scenario. Chaos subsides. Washington steps back. Venezuela stabilizes under a new equilibrium. Chinese assets survive, bruised but intact. In this version, the shock becomes a lesson, and the system, though damaged, endures. The second is the middle path. More likely, instability lingers. Investors hesitate. China maintains its position, but expansion slows. Influence is preserved, but momentum is lost. The long game continues, but with heavier costs and fewer guarantees. Then there is the worst case. The raid becomes a template. Rules are broken again elsewhere. Chinese projects across the global south are treated as strategic threats. Every investment carries political risk. Every partnership becomes a potential flashpoint. This is the future Beijing fears most. Not confrontation, but erosion. A world where patience no longer pays. China will not respond with force. It will respond with time, with persistence, with narrative. But even the longest game depends on one thing, a board that does not collapse beneath it. And that uncertainty sets the stage for the final question. This moment forces us to confront what happened in Venezuela was not a miscalculation. It was a gamble. For Washington, the bet is that decisive action restores dominance. For Beijing, the fear is that unpredictability becomes the new normal. China does not fear loss in one country. It fears a world where power no longer needs rules, because Beijing's rise has depended on something fragile, a system where influence can be built quietly, legally, and over time. When that system fractures, patience becomes a liability. Trump has shown that American power can still move fast and without warning. But speed creates shockwaves, and shockwaves reshape alliances. In the global south, leaders are watching closely, not because they love China, but because volatility from Washington makes stability elsewhere more attractive. This is the paradox of power in 2025. Force can win moments, but consistency wins decades. And here is the insight that matters most. If the future belongs to those who can endure chaos, then the greatest contest between the United States and China will not be fought with raids or rhetoric, but with credibility. If this analysis helped you see that bigger picture, stay with me, because the next chapter of this rivalry is already unfolding, and it will decide far more than Venezuela. it will decide how the world is ruled.